Change. In many ways, we've been talking about change the whole class. This class is about change. As I said on the first class, I wouldn't be teaching it if I didn't think people could change. And when I talk about change here, I'm talking about different levels. Whether it change in terms of introducing a habit. I want to start exercising 3 times a week. Why? Because as you'll see a few weeks from now, exercising 3 times a week has the same effect as some of our most powerful psychiatric drugs. Or let's say a habit you want to introduce is, I want to introduce more spirituality to my life. Or change could be, I want to be happier. I want to experience less anxiety, general anxiety or specific anxiety before tests. Whatever the change you want to introduce in your life, there are certain patterns, certain approaches that work, certain approaches that don't work. And what we're going to do in the next 2.5 classes is differentiate what works and what doesn't so that you can apply it to your life. So first of all, we've talked a lot about change. Let's recap some of the things that we discussed. First of all, on the second class we've already mentioned this. The change is hard. And there are a lot of studies to show how hard change is. The twin research, remember the conclusion, trying to change your happiness is as difficult and futile as trying to change your height. Now, even though they went back on their word and they said, well, it's not really impossible and futile, still, what they did show in their studies is that it is very hard. The twin studies, happiness is a stochastic phenomenon. Then, Daniel Gilbert's work on effective forecasting. Yeah, we experience an up after we get tenure or after we get into Harvard, and we experience a down when we're rejected by Reno or whatever it is. But then very quickly we go back up to our base level of well-being. And most of our life looks like this, around this straight base level. It's very difficult to get an upward trajectory. Possible through coping, for example, but it's difficult. The Cambridge Somerville study, a 5-year intervention that ultimately led to negative change, where there was more alcoholism among the people who did go through that intervention, with the bright and the best. Psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, programs. So we know change is hard, whether it's on the individual level or on the societal level. However, we also know that change is possible. We know that many of the people who argue that change is not possible are making the error of the average, looking at the average score as opposed to outliers, as opposed to people who have introduced change. And when we study change, it's the exception that proves the rule. So if change is possible, if some people have been able to change, whether it's through therapy, whether it's by reading a book, whether it's being part of a class, whether it's through a conversation, sometimes a single sentence that makes a difference to an entire life, there are the exceptions, but the question is no longer whether or not change is possible. The question is, how is change possible? And this is the question that we're going to address in much greater depth on a higher level of the spiral in these lectures. What does change look like? Let's go micro here. Let's go to the brain level. How does change actually look like? What happens in our brain when change occurs? Until 1998, neuroscientists thought that the brain was essentially fixed. We were born with certain neurons, with certain pathways. The brain doesn't grow, doesn't change past the age of, say, 3. Maybe first few experiences the brain still changes, evolves, but after the age of 3, no change. And this theory, which was held until 1998, I mean, that's not so long ago, this theory gave credence and was actually proof positive for happiness as a stochastic phenomenon. You're born with certain genes, you're born with certain inclinations, with certain neural pathways. You have few experiences that really affect you a great deal, as Freud argued, and then the rest of your life you're going to just fluctuate around that same level. No change. That was until 1998. In 1998, scientists started to notice that the brain actually does change. And they came up with the concept of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity. Our neurons are plastic. They change. Not only that, not only do the pathways change in the brain, and we'll look at them in a minute, but also they came up with another concept, which was neurogenesis. Neurons develop, are created throughout our lives until the day we die, potentially. So it's not the fact that we're born with a certain number of neurons and it's downhill from there, as conventional wisdom had us believe, as many people still believe today. No, neurons develop and grow, emerge throughout our lives. The brain, it turns out, in many ways is like a muscle. Use it and you don't lose it. Use it and you generate, you build the muscle up. And the question is, how do we use it so that it becomes an assistant, in a way, help toward becoming happier? So let's look at what the brain actually looks like. What it looks like is that there are millions of channels inside, neural pathways, connections between different neurons in the brain that look something like this. As you can see, some are very thin, are relatively new, some are much thicker, much more established. And the way it works, in many ways, is like in nature. You have large rivers, large channels, and you have tiny rivers and tiny channels. And what happens is that every time a connection is made between neurons, in other words, your thought pattern follows a certain path, that path grows. Just like a river. Every time the water passes there, it gets this much wider. And when there is no water there is no work being done in the neuron, metaphorically speaking, it shrinks a little bit. So neural pathways grow with use, and they shrink when there is no use. If it's something that a new neural pathway that was just created, because remember, there's neuroplasticity, neural pathways are created constantly, there is neurogenesis, new neurons are created constantly. Initially, it's very thin. Let's say, for example, I study French, and I learn a new word. A new connection is made in my brain. Now, if I hear the word once, and never again, the neural pathway will disintegrate, will disappear. However, if I continue hearing that word over and over and over again, after a while it will become thicker and thicker. Again, this is a way oversimplification of the real process, but it will become thicker, and then I will remember it for the rest of my life. It will be established like a river that is established, as opposed to a tiny stream, a trickle that can disappear in a day. And here is the key aspect for understanding how we can change our thought, how we can change our well-being, ultimately. The neural pathways are self-reinforcing, just like rivers are. Think about it. When it rains, when there is a downpour, the water gravitates toward the existing rivers, toward the channels, toward the drains that we have built. It's much less likely to create a new river or a new stream where there was nothing before. So an experience is much more likely to gravitate to already established neural pathways and strengthen it further, as opposed to create new neural pathways. Which is why if we want to remember something, it's very good to make connections to other things, to existing neural pathways, to existing memories. Let me explain this again, because this is important to understand. Because understanding this can actually, this is something that Carol Dweck, professor at Stanford, showed. Understanding this neuroplasticity, understanding how we actually can change, can make us more likely to succeed. And one of the ways of success is to actually become happier. So it's important to understand. An established neural pathway attracts more action. And it attracts more action and gets thicker. Something that's not established, a tiny little stream, is more likely to be just wiped away. As it grows more, it's much more likely to stay, not just stay, grow even more. It is self-reinforcing. And this is what habits are. When something is reinforced over and over again, it becomes a habit. For example, you play tennis and you hit the forehand over and over and over again. Initially, you have to think about it. You have to concentrate. You have to, maybe cock your wrist a little bit, maybe understand exactly where you stop the racket. But after a while, after doing it hundreds or thousands of times, you don't need to think about it anymore. It's already grooved. And the word that they use is grooved specifically because you've essentially created a new channel. And whenever a ball comes toward you, automatically, you don't even need to think about it. It gravitates. Your mind gravitates toward that particular path or paths, many paths, that tell you, lift it up and hit. It's automatic. Same with music. And what they have shown is that people who practice music regularly or practice a sport regularly, their brain actually changes its shape. More neural pathways are created around these areas that mean, let me play a C now, or let me move my fingers in this way, based on something that I see on the page. Certain neural pathways are created, and the brain actually becomes thicker in these areas, where more experiences flow, and the more we do it, the more they flow, until it becomes grooved, and I don't need to think about how to play a C minor. It's automatic. They did research, and this was the first research, or one of the first research projects, where they found that the brain actually changes. They took taxi drivers, or freshly minted taxi drivers from London, and what they had to do to get their certificates and their approval, they had to study the map of London. Now, the map of London is much more complicated than studying the map of New York, those of you who have been to London. But they studied and they spent a lot of time, and what they found was that their brain, part of their visual cortex, actually changed from before they started to study the map of London to after. Because they were working that part of the brain, they had experiences, and these experiences created grooves inside the brain. So when someone said, Oxford Circus, immediately they knew what streets they need to take to Oxford Circus. Their brain actually became bigger. It changed. There is neuroplasticity. And that's wonderful news. It's really wonderful news because it means we have control and we can introduce change. Now, in our brain, there are both healthy and unhealthy pathways. So, for example, some of the negative channels may be one of a consummate warrior, someone who worries a lot, that every time something happens, immediately they gravitate toward, okay, so what does that mean for the future? Or what does that mean now for my prospects? Or what does it mean for today? Constantly worrying about things, even good things very often. They immediately interpret it as something to be worried about. Or fault finding. That's pathways in the brain where I look for, again, they're self-reinforcing, I begin to look for in my world for things that go wrong. Remember my personal experience where when I got the fellowship as a senior here, and I got the fellowship and immediately my brain gravitated toward, okay, but why didn't I get that other one? I had so many things to be grateful for. But as a fault finder, immediately the neural pathway, the river that this experience fell into was the largest one. And the largest one for me at that time was being a fault finder. Then there are positive channels as well. What are the positive channels? Benefit finder. A person who's able to find benefits even in the hardest circumstances. May not say that things happen for the best, but people make the best of things that happen. The optimist. Again, much larger, much wider channels for optimism, and experiences gravitate toward there. Today we know much more how the brain works and where these channels exist. So let me give you an example of one of the things we know. One of the things that we know is that people who have more action on the left side of the prefrontal cortex compared to the right side of the prefrontal cortex are generally happier, more susceptible to positive emotions, more resilient in the face of painful emotions. More activation here, prefrontal cortex, compared to the right side of the prefrontal cortex. People who have more activation on the right side compared to the left side of their prefrontal cortex are generally more depressed. Now, we know that today because we have fMRI, because we have EEG, we can see how much the brain works on each side. But we knew that already hundreds of years ago. We knew that this side was associated with positive emotions, and more activation on this side, on the front, is associated with painful emotions. How? Because when people, for example, were in an accident, and the accident happened to them, and the left side of the prefrontal cortex was damaged, very often they became more depressed because they had more activation on the right side as a result, in comparison. People who had an accident on the right side, on the other hand, on the right side, very often became happier. Now, I don't recommend this as an intervention. Don't try it at home without your parents or with your parents. However, if you walk in the street and you happen to fall, it's always better to fall this way. So just keep that in mind. The important thing to keep in mind then is that very often the same trigger causes very different reactions. Again, the world is not just the external world, it's also the internal world. Remember, to the same mind, as Emerson said, the same world can be a heaven, or to different minds, the same world can be a heaven or a hell. Depends where that experience gravitates towards. Over the years, I've become much more of a benefit finder through the exercise, through thinking about it, by writing, keeping a journal, by physically exercising. I've become much more of a benefit finder. I've done a lot of work in that. One of the great fortunes of my life is that I married a consummate benefit finder. Tommy, my wife, doesn't have to work that hard at it. So, for example, we would come back from a party, and there was someone at the party who couldn't stop talking. Have you encountered a person? Well, couldn't stop talking, and I'm just about to tell Tommy, this person just couldn't shut his or her mouth. And what would she say before I opened my mouth? She said, see how wonderful that person was, and he or she is so passionate about what they do. So for me it was talkative, for her it was passion. Again, automatic going there. There is a genetic set point, and we'll talk about the genes, that lead some people to be much more benefit finders than others. But at the same time, we can work on it. We can work on it pathway by pathway. And what we're doing there is quite literally transforming the brain. We'll talk about during the week on mindfulness, on meditation, that meditation, for instance, regular yoga, actually changes the pathways in our brain, makes us more active on the left side compared to the right side, thus making us more susceptible to positive emotions, more resilient in the face of painful emotions. We can change the brain, neuroplasticity and neurogenesis.